Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Wall of Power Radio Hour. This is your host, Paul Metza. Tonight, I'm excited to have Jim Stoll in the studio with me for the entire show. Jim is an actor, playwright, and one of the finest storytellers in the Midwest. He has a great history of storytelling and plays and acting that he's done in the Twin Cities over the last 40 years. And he's going to talk about his past, his present, and his future. With no further ado, I would like to introduce my friend, Jim Stoll. Tell us a little bit about what you do so that people know who you are and what you do, and then we'll get into your the early years. But
well, what I'm doing right now, because you understand this, this is the next stage in sort of an evolution of life as an artist, as somebody who's worked over 45-something years in theater, right, in the Twin Cities. And I started by doing a completely different kind of work. Now I'm doing mostly storytelling, which grew out of another sort of evolution. I went from writing full cast plays to doing one-person plays. And that had sort of evolved into storytelling. So that's basically what I'm doing right now. At the moment, there's a place in Minneapolis called Cheap Theater, and I am on I think it's a 6 or 7 month project with them. They do a storytelling venue every month, and so I started about 3 months ago. Every month I do a new story, but they're like chapters in a book. And so I'm on coming up this month will be chapter 4. And the subject is, the title of the book, if it was a book, the storytelling, would be The Intoxication of Solitude. And it has to do with my time in the wilderness, and mostly in the parks. So this is not about the time I was in the Amazon or in the mountains in Mexico and all of those other journeys. This is mostly about America's national parks. And then eventually my work, I've spent 16 years as a seasonal park ranger. And so that's what I'm working on right now. I'm on chapter 4 coming up, and eventually there'll be 10 chapters.
Tell us about the park ranger gig.
Oh, it's a wonderful... At one point, I'd been to the Sierra Nevadas in California for 14 consecutive years, backpacking. And then in the summers, in the theater, summer is a really downtime for theater. So I asked my older brother, who was a park ranger. I said, I need a job for the summer. He said, why not try being a park ranger? And miraculously, I got hired at Sequoia National Park in California. And it was because the person they hired quit at the last second. So it was the way I like to put it. They scraped the bottom of the barrel, and there I was.
And timing, as they say, is everything.
Timing is everything, and that's how I got that job. And so I worked out there for a summer. And I wasn't quite ready for it then. This was back in like 1988. I don't do very well with uniforms. For example, when I was in the military, I was always being in trouble. I actually went to jail a couple of times because of insubordination, and I just could never wear my uniform.
Right. Plus, you got to keep those shoes shined.
Well, for example, my shoes. They have certain rules about shoes. The military, they got rules for everything. And so I had shoes that fit the rules, but were totally wrong. They had the right number of holes, but they were these Italian leather shoes, like 3-inch heels. Okay, so they had the right holes, the right color and everything, but they just, were wrong.
Right. Damn your Beetle boots.
Yes, pretty much. Pretty close. And so, I wasn't ready for it in the 80s. But then I went back about 15 years ago, I went back and got a job at Voisers National Park, again, for the summer. But then I worked 14 consecutive seasons in the Apostle Islands and National Lakeshore up in northern Wisconsin. And I worked and lived on an island. Worked and lived in a lighthouse, a historic lighthouse.
And you wore a uniform?
And I wore a uniform, but I was on an island 14 miles away from any office or, any sort of official Park Service people. Mm-hmm. So I wore the uniform, but I was out of uniform every single day.
Right, but it was a vintage uniform because weren't you kind of playing a part?
Oh, I did
there?
occasionally wear the traditional lighthouse keepers uniform, and lighthouse keepers had a uniform.
Right.
They had a specific uniform. No, and my Park Service uniform, I always wore the wrong shoes, and I wore suspenders, which are absolutely not allowable, and little things like that. But I was so far away, nobody ever came out there, and so it was the perfect job for me. I mean, I walked out the back door of the lighthouse, and within 5 minutes in the forest, a few minutes in the forest, I'm in the complete wilderness. And so it was perfect for me. It was possibly the only job I could ever have lasted that long in.
Was there a lot of wolves up there?
No, not there. Not in this part. Very few wolves. We would see them occasionally on the ice with nature cams. Right, but no, that's not a big area for wolves over there. Not a big area for wolves, and there were eagles, and there were years I saw a lot of eagles. But for the most part, Lake Superior is not a good place for eagles. It's a tough scene for me.
How about moose?
No moose over there at all. I never heard of anything up on what's called the Bayfield Peninsula.
Did you go fishing at all when you were?
No, I'm not a fisherman.
Really?
And it's not a fish off.
You're on Lake Superior and you don't fish.
I don't fish. That's just one of the many odd things about me out there. It's not a stand on the dock or stand on the shore fish kind of place for the most part anyway.
You gotta go to the
but you have to go in a boat and you have to get pretty deep for the most part. There's a few places I'm told you can go bass fishing. That's you don't have to go so deep. But for the most part, it's not that kind of a lake.
So when you were wearing your uniform, did you do kind of a historical talk to the visitors to the island?
Sure. That was my job.
Tell us, get into character for just a minute. I'm here with Jim Stoll, great Minnesota storyteller, and he's going to go in character here for what he did as a park ranger on the island.
Sure. Welcome. And then I would say welcome to Raspberry Island. I want to tell you about the lighthouse. The lighthouse was originally constructed in 1862, opened in 1863, right in the middle of the Civil War. This is an awful long way from the Civil War. So for the federal government to spend $6,000, a lot of money in the middle of the war in 1863, and to most seasonal Park Service rangers, it's still a lot of money. And then they built this building out here opened it in 1863 for traffic coming primarily from the west, Duluth and Superior. And they would be going into Bayfield, which in the 1860s was a big port. By 1885, 1886, there were over 350 million board feet of lumber came out of that part of the country, right?
Wow.
And they were
all that white pine.
All white pine, red pine, and then they cut everything pretty much. You know, they went through the big stuff first, and then they went through the small stuff second. And there was logging in the Apostles up until the 1950s, I think, even into the 60s, all the way out on where was it? Wasn't Outer Island? I think it was Outer Island. There was an airport out there, airstrip, right, and so they would fly them out there and fly them back. They call them the Flying Lumberjacks. And so it was logging and brownstone.
Be a good name for a band.
Yes, it is. That's what you think of it. Yes, and it doesn't involve any dead animals in their name, so that's good. It was primarily for that. Then I talked to him about the building, the different outbuildings. There's a huge building there called the Falk Signal Building, and that changed the entire place. They had to bring out a third man. There were two guys working out there. It was the men and their families. So they all lived in one building. So the living circumstances for lighthouse keepers and their families were really quite extraordinary in how they weren't horrible, but you were very crowded. Mm-hmm. I mean, you had to be able to live with all these other people and their families.
So back in when it was built, Jim, in the middle 1860s, how many boats were going by there in the course of a summer?
A busy summer would be over 200 ships.
Wow.
So it was a busy port. When they founded Bayfield, they wanted it to be the next Chicago. Of course, everybody lives there now is really happy that never turned out.
Right.
But there were around Bayfield. There's 3 or 4 places that they're not. You can't tell it now, but there were huge lumber mills. right? And you look at the old photographs, there were these huge lumber mills there. And so that's basically what they were doing. It was lumber, as I said, lumber, fish, and a little bit of brownstone.
In dozens and dozens of shipwrecks.
Lots of shipwrecks. Not so many right in where I was, because I was on what they call the inside, right, as opposed to the open lake. But there's most of the shipwrecks that happened there were not because they ran into rocks or anything like that. It was because something on the ship caught on fire. They used to have what they call donkey motors.
Donkey motors?
Donkey motors. They were essentially what we would call a winch.
Okay.
These days, I think that's my understanding. And they're all run by steam. Fire.
Right.
And there's 4 or 5
boats.
wrecks. Wooden boats. Fire. There's 3 or 4 wrecks there where the ship just caught on fire. And there's a little bay there called Schooner Bay because there's 2 wrecks in that bay. And they just drove the boat right onto the shore. Mm-hmm. Bailed out into the water, made it to shore, and the boat just burned down to the waterline. And then they went in and salvaged as much of the lumber and everything that was in the boat that didn't burn, and pulled it all out. So there's most of the wrecks in my particular area, with a couple of exceptions, which are really quite extraordinary stories. I mean, everybody loves shipwreck stories. Mm-hmm. And so most of them are because of fire. There's one great story, Sand Island, which was near the island I worked on, Raspberry Island, in which they got out into the lake, realized it was too big, turned around and tried to make it back, hit a shoal, and broke the ship right in half. And the sailors mostly on one half, and the passengers and a couple of crew on the other half, they all made it into shore in the lifeboat, and everybody else, I think there was 5 or 6 of them, the crew and the captain all died.
You're back with the Wall of Power Radio Hour. More with Jim Stoll as he continues the story about the shipwreck on Lake Superior.
And the captain washed up onto the shore, and he was very beat up, right? I mean, he was missing arms and legs. It's the lake, right?
Yeah, right.
But it was supposedly had tons of, like $300 or $400 worth of cash on him to pay the crew. When they found him, there was no wallet.
Interesting.
And later, the story goes, a couple of days later, a couple of, as they referred to them in the papers in those days, ne'er-do-wells, showed up in town with lots of money.
Yeah, right.
And some of the money was wet.
Really?
Yes. So they couldn't convict him or anything, but they figured out, okay, we knew what happened to that money.
Wow.
So there's stories like that. So yeah, everybody loves shipwreck stories and ghosts. I was always asked, are there ghosts in the lighthouse? Almost every day somebody would ask me that.
And that's a great title for a song, Ghost in the
Lighthouse. Ghost in the
Lighthouse.
Lighthouse. Yeah, the Blind Lighthouse Keeper. So we've already got 2 bands.
Two bands in a
for you to start.
Title.
This is going to be a whole new beginning for you. Yeah, and I always would tell people, I spent many nights in this lighthouse, and I haven't run into a ghost yet. I've spent most of my adult life working in theaters where there's supposedly always ghosts, right? And I like ghosts. They're not all evil running around trying to kill us. And I said, I haven't run into one yet. If I do, I'll let you know. But the living people are interesting enough for it. So let's just deal with them.
Now, do you work? Are you actually working the lights in the lighthouse?
Oh, no. Nobody does that anymore.
Okay.
It's all automated.
Well,
and it's all run by the Coast Guard. See, I'm on the national park, right? But there's this tiny little thing. There's a big post, and the post has the light.
Okay.
And it turns itself on, turns itself off, and it's all run by the Coast Guard now.
Well, let's go back to that when the ship was on fire and came up into Schooner Bay. Now, how did... there weren't cell phones back then. That was before walkie-talkies and did they have Morse code, or how did they
There was no way to know.
Was it smoke signals, maybe? I don't know.
I mean, there was just no communication about things like that. I mean, there just simply wasn't.
So you had to almost wait for another ship to pass.
Sure.
And try to get their attention.
Sure. I mean, or send up flares.
Yeah.
You could send up flares. Right? The guys, when the ship broke out on the shoal, it was about 5 miles from shore, they sent up flares, many flares. The lighthouse keeper on the island near there, it's called Sand Island, he saw the flares. There was nothing he could do about it. He's not taking a rowboat into a storm that's sinking a major league ship.
Right.
So there was nothing he could do. He just had to sit up there and watch them. And he tried to help them once they got up onto the shore. Right. Beyond that, there was just nothing you can do. Right. The lighthouse keeper at Raspberry Island, where I worked, wrote down in the lighthouse keeper's log, yesterday, 2 fishermen off the coast, about 1.5 miles from where he was, ship capsized and they both drowned. And then period, in the entry log in the log, and general cleaning day. There was nothing he could do, right, to save them. There was nobody he could call. They were just gone. And he reported it to a ship went by. He hailed them down and reported it. The ship went into town and told somebody about it. But that was it. I mean, so no, there was no communication for things like that.
Well, back in the day, did the lighthouse keeper, did they keep any animals like
sure, they had dogs
and cows, but I mean, for chickens. For eggs,
chickens, only chickens. No pigs, no cattle, no sheep, no goats, nothing like that.
Okay.
They didn't have time to deal with it. They didn't have any place to keep it. Once you slaughter them, what do you do with it?
Right.
Right. So no, they didn't have time to deal with all of that.
So.
Chickens.
Yeah. So when the lighthouse keeper went out, they probably brought their supplies in a big boat.
Yep.
And then probably at a certain point, probably resupplied.
Yep. They had a ship. They had special ships that were designed simply for that. That would bring them supplies, equipment, etc., out there. So they were supplied in that way. And then they had a boat to go back and forth to Bayfield, the nearest city of civilization, buy some supplies there and come back out. So, it was, if you've lived in a water culture, any of the lighthouses keepers going by, the other lighthouse keepers, there were 8 of them out there in the Apostle Islands, if they went by Raspberry Island, they stop. Go into town, what do you need? Mm-hmm. And they come back out, they drop it off, they spend the night, you get to socialize with the other guy, the lighthouse keepers, and then back to your island.
Right.
And they meet in town and socialize and back and forth, right? So it was that sort of multifaceted, semi-ad hoc system of supply for the folks out there.
Well, for a writer like yourself, Jim Stoll, it must have been a very creative thing to be a part of when the tourists are gone and you've got all evening to write and read and be inspired.
Oh, yeah. I had some great times out there.
Yeah.
I spent a whole summer out there. I think it was in 2012 or 13. I went down and told at the National Storytelling Festival in Jonesboro, Tennessee. It's the Broadway of storytelling in this little town in the middle of nowhere, Tennessee. They set up 5 tents and they shut the whole town down, which is not very big, but still, they shut the whole town down. You can't drive in. And you go from tent to tent, and they change over every hour, right? And so and you have to have like 4.5 to 5 hours worth of material. 10 minutes, so many 10-minute stories, a couple of 15, 1:30, a couple of 30-minute stories, one hour story, right? And so I spent the whole summer out there rehearsing, standing up at the top of the lighthouse tower, which you can do at the lighthouse, down on the end of the dock, out in the middle of the forest, doing that, right? Rehearsing all those stories to get ready for that.
Wow.
Yeah, that was a great time. And I've done some writing out there while we were living in Bayfield, partially on the island and partially in the little town of Bayfield. My wife and I wrote the script for a play called Church Basement Ladies,
which is
in its 14th year or something.
Right. Still going on.
Still going on. So all of that, I mean, there was some really wonderful things in terms of my writing that happened.
Well, tell us about the Church Basement Ladies.
Well, it's a long story, but we wrote it up there, my wife and I. My wife, first of all, it's about ladies in a Lutheran church in the basement, 4 of them, and a minister, 5 characters total. And as I've always said, I know nothing about women, and I've almost never been to church in my life. So I had to rely upon my wife, Jessica Zolke, who's a Lutheran and grew up a Lutheran and spent a lot of time in church basements.
A lot of casseroles.
A lot of casseroles. She knew all about casseroles. She knew about aprons.
Does she do lutefisk?
Oh, no, we don't do that.
Okay.
But she's suffered through that much of her life. And so I would go out to the island and write, and then come back and say to her, my 2 days off, that's 5 days on the island, 2 days off the island on shore, back and forth. And I'd say, okay, let's go over this. And she would say, no, they would never say that. Not like that. And she would say it more like this.
Right.
Right. And no, they don't eat that. Right. No, never that. No. So it's more like this. So I was sort of like the carpenter building the frame of the house. And I got all of that built, and she'd come in and say, no, here, move this, do that.
Right.
And make it more, So it was a wonderful teamwork.
So what's the storyline? What's going on
it's
in the
4
basement?
different scenes of 4 different times in the lives of these ladies in the church basement. I can't remember it. The first scene is there are 4 emergencies that the ladies fix in the basement. Take care of everything.
You're back with the Wall of Power Radio Hour. More stories from storyteller Jim Stoll. Tell us about that Amazon show. Then I want to talk about the Cuba show you did, because I thought, this guy's got it figured out. He takes his trip, spends how many ever weeks doing that, and then comes back and tells the story and makes money to replenish the coffers that he used to take the trip.
Sort of.
Yeah.
The money-making part was a little trickier. But at one point, I had run a theater here in town called the Palace Theater Company for many years, and there was a lady here in town named Patty Lynch, bless her heart. She doesn't live here, and she lives out in Maine now. And the Palace was over, and I was acting around town. And she got Kevin Kling and I together and said, I want to do an evening of storytelling. And she said, I'd sat around, because I'd worked as an actor with Patty, and she said, we'd sit around and drink a beer and I'd listen to you tell stories. Let's do this. So Kevin and I did an evening. He was on first, and then I was on second, I think. I think that maybe I was first, he was second. Anyway, and it was a huge hit. And to move the set back to put in more seats, even a producer caught on to that. Low overhead costs. One actor, no set. Right? Boom. You make money.
Bare bones, baby.
Yeah, and so it was a hit. Kevin, at that point in his life, he's maybe a generation or so younger than me. He had other interests. But I had been writing full-length plays for like almost 15 or 20 years at that point. So the whole one-man play was a huge change for me. I felt like I was making movies. I could make a movie. I didn't have to worry about it. And so the Amazon show, what happened was, the first show was a hit, and then I went to Central America. And the first show was about Texas, growing up in South Texas, and so that was a hit. And so Patty Lynch said, well, where do you want to go now? And I said, we were in the midst of our illegal and immoral war in Nicaragua at that point. So I want to go to Nicaragua.
Wow.
And she said, okay. We found a sister city program just outside of the Twin Cities, and my wife Jess and I went and lived for a month in Nicaragua, traveled around the country, came back and did that play. That was a hit. I got filmed on KTCA filmed it, and I won an Emmy for that.
You must
in the 80s
come into some dangerous situations.
Oh yeah, we went to get theater equipment in this pickup truck with these guys in this Nicaraguan theater. The theater equipment consisted of a bag of grenades, an automatic weapon, and some clips. At one point, we were at this co-op where they lived and worked, and they said, we want to show you some theater pictures. And they had all theaters are like this. They had a whole wall full of their pictures. And right in the middle of these pictures, I just happened to notice it's a little street, a village, right? And it's a dirt road in the middle of this village. And there's this something, and I look very close in the picture. It's a dead body. It's just shot to pieces. And it was a Contra. And so that was a part of their life. They traveled with weapons. They had an automatic weapon in the bedroom where we slept. So we were pretty close to the front lines at that point. Back in town, back in Leon, Nicaragua, it was just, there was no danger of that nature. The Amazon was different. So after we did that show, we were on TV. Wow, okay. Patty said, what do you want to do next? And I said, I want to go to the Amazon.
Wow.
Because that's always been a dream of mine. We went down there, and it was very difficult. We couldn't do a lot of things. I wanted to live with natives. I went to the Brazilian equivalent of the BIA. It's called FUNAI, F-U-N-I, something like that. I discovered all the Indians, like many Native Americans in this country, totally dislike, hate, or completely distrust the BIA here.
Right.
And that was the way it was in Brazil. They didn't trust FUNAI for good reasons, as I was to discover in a lot of places. So it was... I never really got together with natives at all. But that trip opened doors for the second time, and the second trip was probably the one you saw to the Amazon, and that's where my wife and I lived with Native American people called the Kashinawa. And they were about 2 weeks by boat from the nearest city, which was called Cruzeiro do Sul, which was very close to the Peruvian borders. Where I was in the little village in the Amazon, you could walk across a small river, the Rio Breo, and which was maybe 40 feet across. You could wade across that river, and you were in Peru. So where you sat in the village, you looked across the river into Peru. And so people spoke a little bit of Spanish, a little bit of Portuguese, and their own native tongue, the Kashinawa. And there was a tribe lived right down the river about 6 or 7 hours, and they were the Campas. And so the chiefs in this tribe spoke Kashinawa, Kampa, Portuguese, and Spanish. I always said, that's your primitive guy, guys.
Right.
He speaks 4 to 5 languages.
Yeah, your primitive guy.
Yeah, exactly, right? And they were astonishing, but it was a tough trip.
Yeah.
It was dangerous in that.
How long was it?
Well, we were supposed to go in for, I think, a week to 10 days, and we were there about 3 or 4 weeks. It stopped raining in the middle of the rainy season, and so we were stuck. We couldn't get out. And then I caught malaria.
Oh, man.
And also, what was it? Pneumonia.
Wow.
I had malaria and pneumonia at the same time. So by the time we left on the trip back, it took us about a week to get back by boat. This is where you sling your hammocks up at night on this little boat. Of course, there's no communication of any kind, no electricity or anything like that. And it took us about a week to get back, and most of that week I spent in my hammock.
Wow.
Having hot, because you go through hot and cold, right? I mean, at night I could hardly sleep. I would start to shiver, and then I would go into the sweats back and forth, hallucinations.
Wow.
So Jessica, my wife, fed me most of the time.
Wow.
I didn't think about eating. I couldn't think about it. I went to the hospital there. You should have seen this place. It was more frightening. We went to the hospital, and we said, no, we're not doing this. Jessica had read about this before, and she brought needles. We had 2 needles with us. And when we got to that hospital, they got ready to give me a shot. And heaven knows how many people had had a shot with that needle before they got to me. And Jessica rolled out her own needles. And at that moment, all that time she'd carried that stuff with her, bing, it came in handy.
Wow.
And they gave me a shot, and I got on a plane, because you couldn't get a plane out every day. The plane only came in twice a week, if they could land at the runway. Mm-hmm. Then we went back, and eventually got back to the United States, and I spent about a week in the hospital at the University of Minnesota. Wow. Oh, it was so University.
Talk about suffering for your art.
And University of Minnesota was great. It's a teaching hospital. Mm-hmm. Okay, so they would come in groups and say, they would say to me, the head doctor would say, this guy was in the Amazon, and one doctor said, can you imagine? He could have any one of 1,000 different diseases. They were so excited.
How exciting, right?
Excited. Everybody had to come in and feel my spleen.
Right.
I must have had 20 doctors feel my spleen. Mm-hmm. And they were so excited about all the, did you swim in the rivers? I said, every day. Oh, my God, he could catch anything. Oh, let's try this. Wow. And they would do, there was a lot of poking and plunging in the hospital. And a friend of ours, a mutual friend of ours, Harry Jacob, a doctor, big shot at the University of Minnesota. I finally called him up, and I said, Harry, I'm this experimental thing over here. He shows up and all that came to a stop.
Right.
Because they were ready to do. Let's try this.
Right.
Let's open them up. So we finally got it stopped to that. So I was in the hospital about a week, and it took me 4 or 5 months to get over that. Because I was very run down, and the pneumonia and the malaria and sort of ran me down pretty
well. When you're in the Amazon, I mean, I have to think, especially during the rainy season, there's got to be bugs growing.
Bugs. Oh, different people react differently to the bugs.
Right.
I had boils and big, huge pus things on my body, all over my body. Right. Jessica got bit by the same bugs. It would leave a little red mark. On me, it would swell up and fill up with pus.
Wow.
Okay. She didn't get sick with anything. I got malaria and pneumonia.
Wow.
She came out probably in terrific health. Right. And so it just, it's like the one doctor said to me, it's just not good for you back here.
So what about, anacondas, wild boars?
Oh, we didn't see any of those. None of that's around the village.
Right. Okay.
Because they would have eaten it.
Okay.
There were no monkeys because they ate them. All right. One time we had monkey, okay, which I could not eat.
Right.
There was this little hand floating in the stew.
Woo.
Okay, I couldn't do that. And so, there was nothing like that around the village because they ate it. Right. So that stuff could have been out there.
So I don't know if I want to ask about, did they have dogs?
Yes.
They did have dogs.
They had dogs. And like so many places, it was they treated them horribly. Right. But they were really necessary. Right. They were the guard dogs. Right. We went out of the village one time with some people from the village, and they went to a certain distance, and they said, okay, you can turn around and go on this trail and go right back. Right. We went back. As soon as we got to the edge of the village, here came the dogs. Right. So they treated them just horribly.
And what kind of dogs were they?
Mongrels, long and lean, and whatever they could come up with.
Mean.
And not necessarily mean, but it was their job, right?
Yeah.
And they hit them and they kicked them, and it was awful.
Yeah,
the way they treated their dog. But they were there. They were there in both villages, the Kampa and the Kashinawa, and they served their purpose.
Did you get photos of a lot of this?
Oh, sure. Jessica took lots of photos. They're quite extraordinary, really.
Did you incorporate those into the show?
No. I don't use that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
I just, at that point, and I still feel this way very much, the greatest strength of a one-man show is the fact that it's a one person. And it relies upon the classic storytelling person, somebody sitting around, you're all sitting around the fire, and somebody's telling you a story. It's always been my idea, take us back to that, right? That's what we want. We want that. We need that, and you know that from music. When you get back to that place inside of it with people, and you're going to that kind of place inside of them with people, that's what we need. We want it. We need it. Right.
Right. And it's in our DNA. I mean,
it is.
You had the caves, and then somebody invented fire, and the first thing they did, they sat around the fire and they told stories.
Story. Exactly. And so we need that stuff. And so that's why most of my one-man plays they're pretty simple in terms of the tech. The Amazon show is what I always call my opera, because the theater, alas, no longer with us, the Cricket Theater, built a big set. They had sound effects, lights, and stuff, all kinds of stuff.
Oh, great, perfect for sound effects.
Well, and I had made some recordings, right, of singing and voices and stuff. So they played that, right, at various points. There was a parts in the play where I would hallucinate act out hallucinating on stage because. That was happening to me back there. And so scenes would often come out of hallucinations.
Wow.
Back into reality, back into hallucinations. And so they used the sound effects for stuff like that. So that was my opera. That's the biggest, most technical play I've ever done as a one-person play. I grew up in a storytelling culture, right? South Texas,
Right.
out on the border of Mexico, where storytelling was just a part of everyday life. Right?
And everything's bigger in Texas.
Everything's bigger in Texas. And I won't go into too much about that. So I think it was the culture. And then my work in the theater.
Mm-hmm.
Right? I mean, I came to storytelling from theater. I came to being a one-person actor, storytelling person from theater. So everything for me evolved out of that. Right, and so working with, I learned about what makes a good story, how to put together a good story.
And what does make a good story?
Well, for me, it's basically, I broke it down, a terrific setting, right? And my stories always had these extraordinary settings, right? The in Nicaragua, and then and the Amazon, Cuba, South Texas, the border. La Frontera. So a great setting. And then charismatic characters. On these trips, of course, there's endless charismatic characters. The guy in every one of these countries, I've always met somebody who's just simply, usually several people, who are simply extraordinary characters. Right? And then stakes. What's at stake? Are there high stakes? And for the people involved, and occasionally my wife and I, for the people involved, it was often life and death. Right, the stakes for those people that I was talking about, the situation was often life and death, or certainly very high stakes. In Belfast, Northern Ireland, the people I lived with and the family I lived with in Belfast, they were all Republicans, which is Irish nationalists. I mean, they wanted Northern Ireland reunited with the rest of the Republic of Ireland, and so there were several of the members of the family were in the IRA, right? And a couple of them had been to prison for 5 or 10 years each, right? And so the stakes for those people were always real high. They couldn't have, for example, dogs. They could not have a dog because the police would kill them.
Wow.
They had a dog, and the police came to their house and killed him.
Why?
He got in the way. They wanted to. That's all. They wanted. And it would break their heart to have to stand there and watch hopelessly as the police killed their dog, and which is what they did.
Wow.
Right? And so there's, for those people in these places,
That's terrorism.
that a version of it. And so in every one of these places, the Kashinawa, every day was life and death for them. Right? I mean, you get bit by the snake, you're gone.
Right.
Right? The old man in the village, his job was to go around the edge of the village every day. When we arrived, he had about a 6-foot-long snake he'd killed that day.
Wow.
That was also part of the job of the dogs. And so for those people in these places, you have very high stakes for the people involved. So it's those three elements. You have to have a great setting, fabulous characters, and high stakes.
What were some of your favorite authors? I know you're very well read.
I don't know. I'm sort of a guy, so I read a lot of guys. Although I do love Louise Erdrich. Her work is quite extraordinary. Hemingway is a young guy.
Sure.
Right? I grew up in the 50s and the 60s, and so Hemingway is a great. I'm a great fan of his work, the clarity of his stuff, and the other people like that, Steinbeck, Hemingway.
I have to think a fellow who's I believe he was a St. Paul, Minnesota native, recently passed. Robert Pirsig, The Art of Motorcycle Maintenance.
Yeah, I think I read that when I was a young guy. I can't remember.
Just kind of one of those young guys, like On the Road, all those young guys.
Well, On the Road had a big impact on me. I ended up, and almost getting fired from a theater because me and the guy who was playing, I had a tiny part, and the lead actor in the show and I, one day, I got a big check from something, and we jumped in a car and drove it to California. This was on Monday. We had a show on Friday. We arrived in California, took LSD, and hang around for like a day. Got on an airplane and flew back. And it was all because I was reading On the Road. Come on, man, we got to get in a car. We drove 80 and 90 miles an hour all the way to Minneapolis to L.A. and delivered some poor guy. Who expected us in like 3 days from now. All of a sudden we appear on his doorstep, and it was hard for he wanted to say, how did you get here so fast? But he didn't want to hear the answer, which was, we drove 90 miles an hour night and day.
Dean Moriarty at the wheel.
That's absolutely. Only more, this is modern times, we took LSD all the way out. Well, you stay awake.
Yeah, right.
So, yeah, that was a little different, yeah.
Jim, I saw, I think it was about a year ago at the Black Forest, you told a story, a series of stories, but the one that really stuck with me and brought tears to my eyes was about your Mexican babysitter.
Yeah, and Maria.
Why don't you, could you share that with us? Because it's so timely right now with what's going on.
I'll tell you a little story right now.
Yeah,
how's that?
Please do.
This is just let me do it, see if I can remember this. See a woman's face. See her face. Late 30s, early 40s. Dark skin. She's an immigrant. I'll be honest, at one point in her life, she was an illegal immigrant. Illegal immigrants much maligned these days. See her face as she looks at the first house she has ever owned in her life. She's never owned anything like this. See her face and you will see joy. A joy so intense, it makes her cry. Now watch as she walks to the front door, opens the door, and looks into that house. See her face and you will see pride. But this is the kind of pride she has earned, has every right to. She came from Mexico into the United States illegally, ended up in Minnesota. Her husband is a good man in Mexico, but he couldn't adjust to the United States. He started to drink. He started to abuse her. He started to abuse the children, so she left again. She moved to St. Paul with friends and was selling tortillas out the back door of the house when one of her friends said, you should go to a place in Minnesota, in Minneapolis, called Project for Pride in Living, PPL. They have a job training program. She went, and she passed. And at the end of the program, the people at Project for Living said, well, we don't just train you to work, we help you get a job. And the lady said, I'm going to work here. And the people at PPL said, oh, we love you, and you're wonderful, but we train you to go out into the big world. You can do this. And the lady said, no, I have to work here. And if you put me out that front door, I'm coming in the back. And if you put me out the back door, I'm coming in the front. I'm going to keep coming in the door until you hire me. I have to work here because I want to help people the way you helped me. They hired her as the receptionist. Now she runs the education program. See her face and you will see the pride of an American citizen looking at the first home she has ever owned in her life. Now hear the voices of her children as they run past her, filling those empty rooms with life. See the face of that little boy or that little girl as they open the door to their room. No more sleeping three to a bed. Now they have their own room. See that child's face and you'll see joy, all right. But you'll see pride there as well. Now see the look on that woman's face as she sees the look on her child's face. Oh, and you will see joy. A joy so intense, it makes her cry again. See that woman's face, and you will know what dignity looks like.
Thanks for listening to the Wall of Power Radio Hour. This show is produced by Paul Metzen, Andy Watson, recorded by Paul Sowie at mcn6.org in Northeast Minneapolis. We'd like to thank our guests, Carrie Pickett and Winona LeDuc. Follow us online at wallofpowerradio.com. Like us on Facebook at Wall of Power Radio Hour. And like my dad used to tell me, remember to be kind and make someone happy.